The dust rose in soft clouds as the stagecoach rumbled down the winding dirt road, its wheels creaking with every turn. Clara kept her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the endless stretch of Texas prairie seemed to blur into the sky. It was vast and wild out here, so different from the quiet town she had left behind. And now, this land would be her new home. She smoothed the folds of her blue cotton dress, though it tugged awkwardly at her waist and pulled tighter at her arms than she would have liked. The seamstress back in town had insisted it was the best fit they could manage on short notice, but Clara knew what people whispered whenever she passed. Too round, too large, not fit to be a bride. Their words had clung to her sharper than needles, yet she had come anyway. She had no other choice. The coach slowed and the driver called out, "Here we are, miss. Cole Matthews's ranch." Her heart gave a nervous flutter as she peered out the window. The ranch sprawled before her like a painting come to life. Acres of golden grass swaying in the late afternoon sun, a barn standing proud in red paint, and beyond it, a large wooden house with a wraparound porch. The kind of place that spoke of hard work and wealth. The kind of place that belonged to a man like Cole Matthews, strong, rugged, and distant, if the rumors about him were true. The door of the coach swung open, and Clara hesitated for just a moment before stepping down. Her boots sank lightly into the dirt. She straightened her shoulders, though the weight of every watching eye pressed down on her. A few ranch hands had stopped their work to stare, and she could already see the smirks tugging at their mouths. Their gazes flicked over her figure, lingering too long. Clara felt her cheeks burn. At the top of the porch, Cole stood waiting. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hat tipped low to shade his eyes. He was exactly as people had described him. The cowboy who had built his fortune with his own hands, the widower raising a daughter on his own. His jaw was set hard and his expression gave nothing away. If he was disappointed in what he saw, he did not speak it aloud, but the silence was heavy enough. "Miss Clara," he said finally, his voice deep and even. "Welcome." She dipped her head politely, clutching the handle of her small suitcase. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews." For a brief second, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, curiosity perhaps, or restraint, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He turned, motioning her to follow, and she climbed the steps to the porch, aware of the creak of each board under her weight. Inside, the house smelled of wood and earth, with faint traces of cooking lingering in the air. It was warm, lived in, and yet oddly empty. Clara felt the ache of uncertainty grow stronger in her chest. Was this truly where she belonged? Before she could ask herself again, the sound of small footsteps echoed down the hall. A little girl with golden hair and curious brown eyes peeked around the corner. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Clara's heart softened at once. The girl studied her quietly, then offered a shy smile before darting back into the shadows. It was the first smile Clara had seen since stepping off the stagecoach. And for a moment it was enough to keep her from crumbling under the weight of judgment. She was here now. Whatever laughter or whispers came, she would have to endure them. Because in this ranch, in this family, she was meant to carve out a place for herself, even if no one believed it yet. The sun had barely set when Clara found herself standing in the grand parlor of the Matthews Ranch, her hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling. The engagement supper had been arranged quickly, a gathering of neighbors, ranch workers, and a few women from town who all seemed eager to witness the cowboy's choice of bride. Clara could feel every pair of eyes on her as she stood near the long wooden table, the lamp glow spilling over her features, exposing every curve and softness of her body. She wished more than anything that she could shrink into the shadows, but she could not. She was Cole's intended, and for tonight, that made her the center of attention. The chatter began quietly. At first, no more than murmurs over plates of roasted meat and cornbread. But then came the whispers, sharper, less hidden. "Lord, she's a big one, isn't she? I thought cowboys had better taste than that." Maybe he needed someone who could plow the fields herself. The words drifted through the air like daggers, reaching Clara's ears even as she tried desperately to keep her smile fixed. She lowered her gaze to her plate, the food before her untouched. The dress she had worn, the one she had spent hours sewing patches into, praying it would make her look respectable, now felt like a costume. She could hear 2 women behind her giggling, their voices hushed but cruel. "Did you see how the sleeves strain at her arms? Poor thing. Fabric can only take so much. A hot wave of shame washed over Clara. She wanted to run, to escape the burning heat in her cheeks, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Across the table, Cole sat silent, his face unreadable. He didn't laugh, didn't join in, but neither did he stop it. His indifference hurt worse than the whispers. He hadn't even looked at her once that evening. Not really. When she finally excused herself, she did so quietly, slipping away while the others were too busy gossiping to notice. She climbed the narrow stairs to the room Cole had prepared for her, closing the door behind her with shaking hands. Only then did the tears fall. Clara pressed her palms to her face, muffling her sobs. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers who would gladly use her pain as more fuel for their cruel jokes. But the dam had broken. Every laugh, every mocking word she had endured throughout her life came rushing back. Fat Clara, big as a barn. Who would ever want her? And yet here she was, in a beautiful ranch house with a man she was supposed to marry. A man who didn't even care enough to shield her from humiliation. She thought of her late parents, of how they had told her once that someday someone would see beyond her size, beyond her insecurities, and love her for the heart she carried. But as she sat on the edge of the bed, her dress wrinkled beneath her, Clara wondered if they had been wrong. A soft sound pulled her from her thoughts, a knock at the door. She quickly wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. The door creaked open, and there stood the little girl she had seen earlier, Cole's daughter, Lila. The child tilted her head, her brow furrowing as though she could sense Clara's sadness. "You're crying," Lila whispered, stepping into the room. Clara forced a small smile, though her voice trembled. "It's nothing, sweetheart. I'm just tired." Lila walked closer, her tiny hand reaching to rest against Clara's arm. "They were being mean, weren't they?" she asked softly, her eyes far too wise for her years. Clara's throat tightened. She didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Lila climbed onto the bed beside her and leaned against her side without hesitation. The weight of that small, innocent gesture brought fresh tears to Clara's eyes. But this time, they weren't from shame. For the first time since her arrival, she didn't feel completely alone. Outside, the laughter from the parlor carried on, cruel and careless. But inside that quiet room, Clara held on to the small comfort of a child's kindness, letting it steady her trembling heart. She knew she had a long road ahead, and she wasn't sure how much more she could endure. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a reason she had been brought here, one that went beyond the cruelty of strangers and the coldness of a cowboy. And though she didn't yet know it, the words that would soon come from Lila's lips, words simple, pure and unshakable, would begin to change everything. The morning after the engagement supper, the ranch stirred awake with the crowing of roosters and the clatter of pans in the kitchen. Clara rose early, smoothing her hair into a neat braid before making her way downstairs. The memory of the laughter still clung to her like smoke after a fire, but she steeled herself, determined to face the day with dignity. When she stepped into the dining room, Cole was already there, seated at the head of the table with a cup of black coffee in his hand. He looked up briefly, his gray-blue eyes cool and unreadable, then returned his attention to the newspaper spread before him. "Good morning," Clara said softly, setting her hands against the back of a chair. "Morning," Cole replied without looking at her. His voice was deep, steady, and polite enough, but there was no warmth in it. She hesitated, then sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. A plate of eggs and biscuits sat waiting, and though the smell was tempting, Clara found her appetite absent. She reached for her fork but quickly set it back down, her stomach too knotted to eat. Cole cleared his throat, folding the newspaper with deliberate care. "The wedding will be in a few weeks," he said plainly, as though discussing a business deal. "Best we get it done before the fall cattle drive." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of his tone. "A few weeks? That soon? Don't see much point in waiting," he replied. He leaned back in his chair, studying her for the first time since she entered. His gaze wasn't cruel, but it wasn't tender either. It was the look of a man measuring a fence post, not a bride. "Lila needs a woman in the house. Someone steady. You'll do? You'll do." The words cut sharper than any insult whispered by townsfolk. She lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening in her lap. Was that all she was to him? A solution to a problem? Not a partner, not a woman worth loving, but simply suitable enough. She wanted to ask him why he had chosen her of all people. Surely a man like him could have married any number of women. Prettier, slimmer, more polished, why her? But she bit back the question, afraid the answer would wound her more deeply than she already was. Instead, she nodded faintly. "I'll do my best." Cole gave no reply. He rose from the table, drained the last of his coffee, and set the cup down with a quiet thud. He adjusted his hat, already reaching for the door. "Ranch work won't stop for a wedding," he said over his shoulder. "I'll be out in the fields most days. If you need something, talk to the housekeeper. She'll show you the ropes." With that, he was gone, the heavy door shutting firmly behind him. Clara sat in silence, staring at the empty chair he had left behind. A hollow ache spread through her chest. She had imagined marriage would bring companionship, perhaps even affection, if not love. But in Cole's eyes, she was nothing more than a placeholder. A convenience. Later that day, Clara wandered through the house, trying to acquaint herself with its rooms. The place was beautiful, with polished wooden floors and sunlit windows overlooking the fields, yet it felt unbearably cold. The walls echoed with absence, as though laughter had long ago been banished. Only in the garden did she find a glimmer of warmth. Lila was there, kneeling in the dirt with a small basket, her little hands plucking wildflowers. She looked up at Clara with a bright smile that made something fragile inside her stir. "Do you like flowers?" Lila asked. Clara knelt beside her, smoothing her skirts. "I do. They make the world a softer place." The child giggled, handing her a daisy with petals frayed by the wind. Clara tucked it carefully into her braid, earning another delighted laugh. For a brief moment, the ache in her chest eased, but when she glanced back toward the house, her heart sank again. She could see Cole in the distance, out by the stables, his strong frame outlined against the sky. He didn't look their way, didn't notice the gentle moment unfolding between his daughter and the woman he had chosen to marry. Clara turned back to Lila, forcing a smile. The little girl's presence was a balm, but the truth was clear. She was not wanted by the man whose home she now lived in, and though she tried to push the thought away, it lingered like a storm cloud. How long could a heart endure such coldness before it broke entirely? The days that followed slipped into a quiet rhythm. Clara kept herself busy with small tasks around the ranch, mending linens, helping in the kitchen, tending the flowers that grew wild along the fence. Though no one had asked it of her, she needed the work, something to keep her mind from dwelling on Cole's distance. He was polite when they crossed paths, always respectful, yet there was a wall between them as solid as the stone hearth in the parlor. He never spoke cruelly, but neither did he speak kindly. Clara began to wonder if he even saw her at all, beyond the duties she might one day fulfill. But with Lila, things were different. The little girl trailed after Clara each morning, curious and bright-eyed. Clara had shown her how to braid ribbons into her hair, how to press daisies between book pages, how to hum lullabies her own mother used to sing. In those moments, Clara felt something awaken inside her, a sense of belonging, of being needed that no cruel whisper could take away. One evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and lavender, Clara found herself in the garden again. She had shed her apron, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she was kneeling beside a patch of stubborn wildflowers that had pushed through the soil. Lila sat beside her, chattering about the foal she'd seen that morning, her little hands stained with earth. Cole stepped onto the porch then, his broad frame outlined by the fading light. He had finished his work for the day, and though his expression was as unreadable as ever, his eyes sought out his daughter instinctively. Clara noticed the way his shoulders eased when he saw her safe, her laughter rising into the twilight. "Daddy!" Lila called, leaping to her feet. She ran to him, her skirts flaring, and tugged at his hand. "Come see!" Clara's making the flowers grow prettier. Cole allowed himself to be pulled forward, though his gaze flicked briefly toward Clara, guarded as always. He stopped a few steps from the garden, watching as Lila bounded back to Clara's side and pointed at the daisy crown they had been weaving. "Isn't it pretty, Daddy?" the little girl asked, her eyes shining. Then, with the blunt honesty only a child could carry, she added, "She is pretty, Daddy." The words fell into the quiet evening like a stone into still water, rippling outward. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Heat rose to her cheeks, though this time it wasn't from shame. It was from something softer, something she didn't dare name. She dared a glance at Cole, searching his face for mockery, for dismissal, but there was none. Cole's jaw shifted slightly as though the simple words had unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. He looked at his daughter first, her innocent smile wide and trusting. Then his eyes lingered on Clara just a moment longer than usual. Pretty. He had never thought of her that way, not really. When he agreed to marry her, it was for Lila's sake, for the steadiness of a woman in his household. He had told himself looks didn't matter, yet now, hearing the word from his daughter's lips, he found his gaze softening against his will. Clara's cheeks were flushed from the evening air, her hair catching the last threads of sunlight, her hands still cradling the fragile crown of flowers. She looked up at him, startled and vulnerable, and for the first time, he didn't see just the weight she carried. He saw gentleness. He saw strength in the way she endured. He saw kindness in the way she tended to his daughter without being asked. Cole cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "That so?" he asked lightly, glancing down at Lila. "Yes," the girl said with firm certainty, as though no one could ever argue otherwise. "She's pretty and nice. And I like her." Clara bit her lip, her eyes stinging with sudden tears she tried to blink away. No compliment had ever meant more, not because of the word itself, but because of who had spoken it. To be seen through the eyes of a child innocent and unclouded by cruelty was to be given a kind of truth no gossip could tarnish. For a long moment, Cole said nothing more. Then with a slight nod, he tipped his hat. "Best get cleaned up before supper," he said, his voice rougher than before. He turned back toward the house, but his steps were slower, his shoulders not quite as stiff. Lila giggled, proud of her declaration, and went back to her flowers. Clara sat very still, her heart beating hard. The words echoed in her ears. "She's pretty, Daddy." And though she knew they were spoken with a child's innocence, they planted a seed inside her. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be seen as more than what others mocked. And perhaps, one day the cowboy himself might see it too. That night, long after the lamps had been blown out and the house had gone quiet, Cole lay awake in his bed. The mattress was familiar, the room steeped in the scent of wood and leather, but his mind was restless. He heard his daughter's words again, as clear as if she were whispering them in the darkness beside him. "She is pretty, Daddy." It wasn't the kind of thing that usually caught Cole Matthews off guard. He'd faced stampeding cattle, gunfire in the dead of night, the hardships of drought and debt. But this, the innocent truth spoken by a child, his child, had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He had chosen Clara out of necessity. He hadn't been cruel about it, but he hadn't fooled himself into thinking it was love either. He needed a woman to care for Lila, to bring stability to the ranch, to ease the burden of loneliness he would never admit to carrying. Clara was willing, practical, and that had been enough, or so he thought now. When he closed his eyes, he saw her kneeling in the garden, hair catching the last strands of sunlight, her hands gentle as she wove daisies into a crown. He saw the way Lila looked at her, as if she had been waiting all her short life for someone like Clara to arrive. And he remembered the way Clara's eyes had darted to his after Lila spoke, full of hope and fear and something he hadn't wanted to name. Pretty. He had never once thought of his bride in those terms, but now he couldn't shake the idea. The next morning, he found himself watching Clara more closely. He noticed the way she hummed softly while stirring the pot of beans, a tune that seemed to soothe Lila's restless energy. He saw her bend to pick up a basket heavier than most women could lift, her breath quick but determined, never once asking for help. He heard her laughter, a rare sound, soft and unsure, but genuine, when Lila insisted on teaching her the names of every horse in the stable. Cole kept his distance, as he always had, but something in him shifted. Where once he had only seen a woman filling a role, now he began to see a woman of strength, of patience, of quiet grace. Still, he fought it. At supper one evening, a ranch hand delivered news of a fence needing repair. Cole excused himself quickly, eager for the distraction. As he passed through the doorway, he caught sight of Clara reaching for the serving dish. Her sleeve slipped back, revealing a faint scar along her forearm. Nothing dramatic, just a pale line against her skin. He paused, unexplainably curious about its story. But before he could ask, he forced himself forward, reminding himself that feelings, romantic, foolish feelings, had no place in this arrangement. And yet later that night, he found himself standing in the darkened hallway outside Clara's room, hearing the faint murmur of her voice. She was reading aloud, her voice tender and low. He peered around the doorframe and saw her seated on the edge of the bed, a book open in her lap, Lila nestled against her shoulder, fast asleep. The sight pierced him deeper than he expected. Clara didn't just tolerate his daughter, she cherished her. That kind of love couldn't be bought or bargained for. It was real, and it was rare. Cole stepped back quietly, his boots hardly making a sound against the floorboards. He returned to his room, but the image stayed with him. Clara's soft voice, the way Lila curled against her as though she had always belonged there. For the first time, Cole began to question whether he had been wrong about Clara, wrong to think of her as merely suitable, wrong to measure her worth by what others whispered. He remembered how the townsfolk had laughed, how the women had sneered, and shame rose in his chest, not for Clara but for himself. He had let their cruelty hang in the air without lifting a hand to stop it. He had stood silent while she bore their mockery alone. A seed had been planted, one he could no longer ignore. And though Cole Matthews was not a man easily swayed, he knew the truth when it stared him in the face. His daughter had seen something he had been too blind, too stubborn to notice. Clara was more than enough. She was more than practical, more than you'll do. She was the kind of woman who could fill the empty spaces in this house, the kind of woman who might, if he let her, fill the empty spaces in his heart. The weeks passed with a rhythm that felt almost steady. Clara was finding her place in the ranch, cooking with the housekeeper, tending the flowers along the porch, and weaving herself into Lila's world with games, bedtime stories, and shared secrets. Cole remained distant, but not as cold as before. Sometimes she caught his gaze lingering longer than it used to. His expression softened in ways that unsettled her heart. Still, the whispers of doubt never left her. She could bear Cole's silence. What she could not bear was the cruelty of others. It was on a Saturday afternoon when Cole took her and Lila into town. He needed supplies for the ranch, and Clara thought perhaps it might be a chance to prove herself, to show she could stand proudly at his side, no matter what others thought. She wore her best dress, a pale lavender one that had cost her nearly all her savings. She braided her hair carefully, tied with a ribbon Lila had insisted was the prettiest. At first, things seemed fine. The general store smelled of pine and flower dust, and Clara busied herself helping Lila choose small candies from the jar. Cole was at the counter speaking with the shopkeeper, his voice steady, his manner businesslike. Clara let herself breathe, but then she heard it. Two women standing near the bolts of fabric, speaking in tones too loud to be accidental. Can you believe it? The great Cole Matthews marrying her? One said, eyes darting toward Clara. Lord have mercy, he must be desperate, the other replied with a laugh. Didn't think Cowboy settled for, well, that size. Another snicker. Bet she eats more than the ranch hands combined. Clara froze. The candy jar in her hands trembled slightly, glass clinking against glass. She kept her eyes down, praying Lila hadn't heard. But the child's little face had already tightened into a frown, her small hand gripping Clara's skirt. The women weren't finished. I almost feel sorry for him. A man like Cole tied down to a woman who'll never look proper at his side. Hush, the other said, though her smirk remained. Don't you know she's too busy trying to squeeze into dresses that don't fit to notice? The words rang in Clara's ears. Too heavy, too much, never enough. They had been her lifelong chorus, following her from childhood into womanhood, and now here they were again, sharp as knives, cutting through the fragile hope she had begun to build. She set the candy jar back on the shelf with shaking hands. Come along, Lila, she whispered. The little girl clung tighter. Don't listen to them, she said fiercely, her brown eyes flashing. They're mean, Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to believe it was that simple, but the shame pressed too heavily. She moved through the store like a shadow, keeping her head bowed until Cole returned with the parcels. He noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the redness around her eyes, but said nothing. Not in the store, not on the wagon ride home. His silence was protection of a kind, but it was not enough to shield her from the ache inside. That night, Clara sat by the window in her room, staring out at the moonlit fields. She thought of leaving, of packing her small suitcase and slipping away before dawn. Surely it would be easier for everyone. For Cole, for the gossips in town, even for herself if she simply disappeared. She was tired of being a burden, tired of being a target. But then the door creaked softly, and a small voice broke through the stillness. Don't go, Lila whispered. Clara turned, startled to find the little girl standing there in her nightgown, her hair mussed from sleep. She padded across the room and climbed onto Clara's lap without waiting for permission. "You're not gonna leave, are you?" she asked, her small hands gripping Clara's sleeve. "I don't want you to. I like you here. I like you better than anyone." Clara's chest ached as she wrapped her arms around the child. She buried her face in Lila's hair, inhaling the scent of soap and sunshine. "I don't want to leave you, sweetheart," she whispered. "Not ever." Lila leaned back just enough to meet her eyes. "Then don't. Daddy doesn't say much, but he looks different now. He likes you too. I can tell." The innocence, the certainty in her voice struck Clara deeply. Maybe the world outside would always laugh. Maybe gossip and mockery would never stop. But here in this house there was a little girl who believed in her, and that belief was worth more than all the cruel whispers in the world. The harvest fair came to town once a year, a day of music, horse races, and pie contests, where the whole county gathered to celebrate the end of long, grueling summer work. Cole had always gone, part business, part tradition, and this year was no different. Only this time Clara was at his side. She had hesitated when he asked her to come. Memories of the last trip into town still clung to her like thorns, each cruel word replaying in her mind. But Lila had begged her, clutching her hand and insisting it would be fun, and Clara couldn't bring herself to disappoint the child. So she dressed in her best again. This time a soft green dress she had mended carefully. She tied her hair with a ribbon Lila had chosen, and when she caught her reflection, she whispered to herself, "Hold your head high." The fairgrounds buzzed with life, children darting with sticky fingers from candy stalls, fiddles playing lively tunes, the smell of roasted corn drifting on the warm air. Clara stayed close to Cole and Lila, trying to blend into the crowd, but she felt the stares. Always the stares. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. "Is that her? The bride?" Poor Cole. Could have had any woman he wanted, and he chose her? Look at the size of her. What a sight beside him. Clara's chest tightened. She fixed her gaze on Lila, who was tugging at her sleeve, pointing excitedly toward the carousel. But then a sharper voice rang out. This time not hushed, not whispered, but loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Well, I'll be," a man drawled, leaning against the fence with a smirk. "Cole Matthews, the toughest cowboy in these parts, and he went and caught himself a wife who looks like she eats more than his cattle herd." Laughter rippled through the small crowd gathered nearby. A few tried to hide it, but others grinned openly, waiting to see what Cole would do. Clara froze, her cheeks flaming. She wanted the ground to open and swallow her whole. She braced herself for Cole's silence, because that was what he had always given her in the face of cruelty. Silence. Indifference. But this time, something different happened. Cole straightened to his full height, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the smirking man. His eyes, usually calm and distant, burned with a fire Clara had never seen. "You best watch your tongue," he said, his voice low, steady, but carrying the weight of thunder. The man chuckled nervously. "Oh, come on, Cole, just a bit of fun. No harm meant." Cole stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The laughter in the crowd stilled. "You calling my wife a joke? That sound like no harm to you?" His voice was sharp now, dangerous. Clara's heart stumbled. "Wife." He had said it plainly, firmly, as though there was no question, no shame. The man stammered, his smirk faltering. I didn't mean—" Cole cut him off, his voice rising so all could hear. "Clara is my wife. She runs my home, cares for my daughter, and stands by my side. She's got more strength and kindness in her than any of you flapping your jaws ever will, and if any of you think you can laugh at her, you'll answer to me." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant fiddle tune still playing across the fairgrounds. The crowd shifted uneasily, eyes dropping, whispers dying in throats. The man who had spoken backed away, muttering something, but no one dared join him. Cole turned then, his gaze softening as it landed on Clara. For once there was no indifference, no guarded wall, only a quiet sincerity that made her throat ache. "Let's get you some pie." "Darlin'," he said gently, offering his arm. Clara blinked back tears as she placed her hand on his sleeve. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she didn't feel like a shadow trailing behind him. She felt seen. She felt claimed, not as an afterthought, not as a convenience, but as his wife. As they walked away, Lila skipped happily between them, her little voice carrying through the quiet crowd. "See, I told you, Daddy, she's pretty." This time Cole didn't look away. He glanced down at Clara, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint, unguarded smile. "You sure did, Peanut," he murmured, his eyes never leaving Clara's. And in that moment, the weight of every cruel whisper, every mocking laugh began to crumble. Clara walked taller, her hand steady on Cole's arm, her heart daring, just daring to believe she had finally found where she belonged. The fair incident lingered long after the crowd had scattered. For Clara, the words Cole had spoken echoed louder than the cruel laughter ever had. "She is my wife." Not "you'll do," not silence, not indifference, but proud public claim. The memory wrapped around her heart like a warm quilt. Back at the ranch, life returned to its usual rhythm, but something in the air had shifted. Cole still carried himself with the same rugged composure, still worked the fields from dawn until dusk, but Clara began to notice the small ways he had changed. He lingered at the supper table longer, listening when she spoke instead of retreating to silence. He offered her his hand when she stepped down from the wagon, a simple gesture, but one that made her breath catch. Sometimes she even caught him watching her, not with the cool detachment of before, but with quiet wonder, as though he were finally beginning to see what Lila had seen all along. One evening, after a long day of work, Cole returned to find Clara and Lila sitting on the porch steps. The little girl was curled against Clara's side, fast asleep with her head in her lap, a book still open on the step beside them. Fireflies flickered in the dusk, their glow soft and fleeting. Cole stopped in his tracks, his chest tightening at the sight. He had grown used to Clara's presence in his home, but he realized in that moment that he no longer thought of her as filling a role. She was part of this place, part of him, part of Lila's laughter and comfort. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dirt. Clara looked up, startled, her hand brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice careful. "She fell asleep before I could finish the story." Cole shook his head, lowering himself onto the step beside her. "Don't apologize. She hasn't slept that peaceful in years." The words hung between them, simple but heavy with meaning. Clara blinked, her throat tightening. She looked down at the child sleeping in her lap, then back at Cole. For the first time, she saw not just the cowboy, not just the man hardened by loss and work, but a father quietly aching for the family he thought he'd lost forever. "You're good with her," he said quietly, his eyes on Clara now. "Better than I could have hoped." Clara swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed Lila's hair. "She makes it easy. She's given me more than I could ever give her." Cole's gaze lingered. He thought of the townsfolk, the cruel words, the laughter that still echoed in his memory. And he thought of how Clara had endured it, head bowed but spirit unbroken, and how she still poured kindness into every corner of his home. "You've given her more than you know," he said. His voice was steady, but there was a roughness to it, as though the words cost him something to admit. "And me too." Clara's breath caught. She dared a glance at him, her heart stumbling. "You don't have to say that, Cole." He turned then, really turned, his eyes locking with hers. "I don't say things I don't mean." Silence fell thick and charged. The world seemed as still around them. The hum of crickets, the flicker of fireflies, even the soft breath of the sleeping child. Clara felt something shift deep inside, a door opening that she had long believed was locked to her. In that silence, Cole reached out, his rough hand covering hers where it rested on Lila's shoulder. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. For a long time, neither of them moved. Finally, Clara whispered, her voice breaking, "Do you really see me?" Cole's jaw tightened, but his eyes softened, unguarded. "I see you, Clara. Not what folks in town say, not what you think you lack. I see you, and you're beautiful." The tears came then, unbidden and unstoppable. But this time they weren't born of shame or humiliation. They were tears of release, of hope, of a heart that had carried too much loneliness finally finding rest. She pressed her hand against his, her voice trembling. "No one's ever said that to me before." "Well," Cole murmured, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. Then they were blind. For the first time, Clara let herself believe it. Lila stirred in her sleep, mumbling softly, and then whispered with childlike certainty, "She's pretty, Daddy." Cole smiled, his eyes never leaving Clara's. "She's more than pretty, Peanut," he whispered back. "She's ours." And with those words, the laughter of strangers lost its power. The cruel whispers dissolved into nothing, And Clara Matthews, once the bride everyone mocked, finally felt what she had longed for all her life. She was loved. She was home.